I'm rising today, Madam Speaker, to speak to the government's proposal to provide pardons for people who have convictions or criminal records for simple possession of marijuana accrued prior to the legalization of marijuana. That legislation, which legalized marijuana, was something that, again, we felt that the government probably could have done better overall, but that we did support ultimately, because we thought it was time to move on from the approach to marijuana that this country had had for a long time, and believed that making the product one that you could regulate and trying not to have situations where people's lives are being ruined over simple pot possession was a good thing overall, Madam Speaker. And so the question that comes up now is, what do you do with the over 400,000 Canadians who have records for simple possession, some of whom got those just prior to marijuana becoming legal, versus the people who now may have the same small amount of pot in their possession who don't have criminal records? And there's a question of fairness for those people who have records extant for something that now is completely legal and not a problem. And so we know that those criminal records present all sorts of barriers, Madam Speaker. They present barriers to people being able to access housing in some cases. They present barriers to people to be able to volunteer in their community and support local organizations that depend on those volunteers. They present barriers to travel, which can be important for employment purposes, Madam Speaker. And particularly, it presents a barrier to travel to the United States. It's been very clear that a question they may ask at the border is whether anybody has smoked marijuana. If the answer is yes, you may be turned away at the border. And in fact, not only can that be a problem for people who have a job that requires them to cross the border, Madam Speaker, but it can be a problem for people to get a job in the first place. And we know that criminal records, even for something like simple pot possession, have in fact been and are barriers to people getting employment. And so when we talk about wanting people to be able to get a job and support themselves, it doesn't make sense that they wouldn't be able to do that because they got caught with a gram or two of pot at some point in the 80s or the 90s, or even just a couple of years ago when it was still illegal. And so part of the idea behind this bill, I think, is to try and do away with that. The question is whether or not it uses all of the right tools at the government's disposal, and whether or not it's going to succeed, Madam Speaker. And this is where we think the government has seriously failed to adopt an approach that will get the job done. Not just get it done in the right way for the people affected, but also to get the job done in the way that's most efficient and cost-effective overall, Madam Speaker. So the means by which the government has proposed to try and reduce some of the burden of having that simple pot possession charge on people's record has been to expedite a pardon, or what's also sometimes referred to as a record suspension, Madam Speaker. There's a few problems with that. Number one is that we're talking about a lot of people, and we're talking about an offense that really is not very serious. So this approach requires that people initiate this process themselves, which means they have to know that it's available to them. Then they have to initiate it themselves, Madam Speaker. They may need legal advice along the way, which can be expensive and frankly out of reach for certain people, including some of the most marginalized people. And when we talk about people being affected by simple pot possession charges, I think we have to acknowledge that in many cases we're talking about some of the most marginalized people in the country, particularly racialized people. Because we know that statistics for conviction in the Black community and Indigenous communities, just for example, Madam Speaker, are far higher than they are in other communities and other racial groups within Canada. So we are talking about marginalized people, and this is a process that's going to require Canadians who have those pot possession charges to have the resources to be able to seek legal advice, particularly if they don't get a favorable decision in the first place, Madam Speaker. So it doesn't make sense from that point of view. What would have made more sense was an automated and automatic process so that people don't have to apply. They don't have to know that this is something that is available to them if they want it, but just for government to know that if somebody has one of those charges, that those no longer apply. The other problem with record suspensions, besides the cumbersome process, and I just, on that point of cumbersome process, Madam Speaker, would add that the Standing Committee on Public Safety recently released a unanimous report, so all parties agreed, that the pardon process in Canada is needlessly convoluted, that it takes a long time and overall just isn't going well. So now we're talking about over 400,000 people in the country who have simple pot possession charges who may want to be accessing that system, adding further burden. And as the member from Edmonton West rightly pointed out, and he may ask me a question about this afterward, I don't know. If you go through the departmental plan and the budget, there's no additional resources being allocated for this projected increase in the demands for pardon. So it's needlessly cumbersome. It's going to take time. It requires these people to know about the option, to take the initiative themselves, maybe have to pay for legal advice. And at the end of the day, if they're asked pointedly, whether it's at the border or whether it's by an employer or somebody else, whether or not they have such a conviction, they still have to answer yes. Because although a pardon removes their charge from the most commonly used database, that charge still remains, that conviction, that record still remains in a number of other databases. That information may be shared with other countries. It may be shared in other ways between government agencies or police services. So there are still, there's still the possibility that existing record will be shared in some way, shape, or form that prevents people from traveling or gaining employment. So what my colleague from Victoria has rightly proposed as the alternative in his private member's bill is an expungement regime. And if you were to expunge the record, that means it's actually gone, Madam Speaker. It means that if somebody is asked whether they've ever been convicted for simple pot possession, they can truthfully say no, because that's the power of expungement. Just as in this place, certain things are sometimes stipulated. You know, the House can deem, even though it's just after 4 o'clock, if the House deems that it's 8 o'clock and we adjourn, the House can do that. In the same way, an expungement essentially deems the offense never to have occurred, which is not true of a pardon. So if we truly want to make it the case that people who are guilty of simple pot possession don't have to worry ever again what that charge, whether it's from the 80s, 90s, or just a couple of years ago, means for the rest of their life, the way to do that is expungement, Madam Speaker. And it's frustrating that the government didn't choose that approach. It's still unclear to me why the government didn't choose to go down that road. I haven't heard a reason that I find compelling, frankly. And I'm not sure who gets the win in this either, to be honest. Like, I don't know who benefits from having an expedited pardon regime that really only does half the job and presents real administrative challenges for the parole board versus expungement, which wouldn't produce those same challenges, which wouldn't require extra resources, and would actually do the job better for Canadians who are affected by convictions for simple pot possession. So if this option is cheaper, if it's more efficient, if it actually really gets the job done in a way that expedited pardons don't, I just don't understand why the government isn't interested in going down that road. And that's why it's very difficult for me to support this, because it doesn't do the job, it costs more money, and that just sounds like bad policy, Madam Speaker. I mean, when you say it out loud, I don't, unless I hear a compelling reason why expedited pardons are better than expungement, I don't know why we wouldn't do it that way. It's not for lack of forewarning. The NDP, right from go, when the government first introduced its legislation to legalize marijuana, has been bringing up many times the need to deal with all of those people who have existing convictions, who are now going to be in that position of, I think, fundamental unfairness, where somebody who did the exact same thing after the law passed doesn't have any problem. Canada has now said that this is legal and it's not a problem. You've got people that did it just a couple of years ago that are in trouble. so they knew that this was coming down the pipe. We asked for them to deal with it properly with the legalization package. They didn't, and I just wonder why it is that we need to do something that's going to cost more and be less effective for those who need it.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Guelph.
Madam Speaker, and thanks to the honourable member from across the way from Elmwood Transcona. The discussion we've had in previous debates in this House around expungement had to do with the complications that affect people who have records in the United States that go to cross the border if there isn't a match-up of paperwork and paper trail. If expungement took their records out of the system, there would be a disconnect between the legal records in Canada, the legal records in the United States. Could the honourable member comment on expungement for travellers going to the United States and how that might be a risk for them to have to get additional pardons to get across the border?
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Yeah, I'm just going to take a moment to fully process that question. I mean, certainly I would say that first of all, if we want to begin making the case for people not getting in trouble at the border, them not having a criminal record in Canada would be the right start. And then the proper approach would be to advocate to our counterparts in the United States to also delete that record, letting them know that it's now legal in Canada. These people are not, in the eyes of Canadian law, have not committed any crime, and then therefore shouldn't be in any U.S. database as having committed a crime in Canada. That was part of our frustration, not just around the USMCA negotiations, but other international negotiations between Canada and the United States, that this issue was not being brought up and that the Liberal government did not get any guarantee or any reassurance from the United States government that they wouldn't unfairly penalize Canadians either who have had a record or who have simply smoked pot and may be proven to have smoked pot in other ways. We think that the United States policy on this is completely unreasonable, and the answer isn't to try and cohere better with the unreasonable policy of the Americans. The answer is to have a clear, consistent policy that makes sense here, and then advocate for our American counterparts to reflect that. I think it's just a sign of the kind of attitude of contrition we so often get from Liberals when it comes to the United States.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Edmonton West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for his speech today. He's like me, probably the only other person in the House actually reads the departmental plans, and I'm pretty sure the Minister of Public Safety doesn't read such plans. He commented about the lack of resources put forward to this. The minister figures about $2.5 million will be spent. That works out to about 2% of the eligible Canadians who can actually ask for a suspension. Does the member believe that perhaps they're just not taking it seriously, or perhaps they're going to make this process incredibly difficult for average Canadians? What do you think they've only put aside enough or figure enough resources to help just 2% of the Canadians affected by their pot convictions?
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, it is somewhat perplexing. I mean, and it's something that we've seen when it comes to other issues too, for instance, like pay equity, when they say, okay, well, we're going to move ahead with pay equity in the federal civil service, finally, after being told many times that that was something they're actually required to do, but then there's no money for it in the budget. And so, I mean, one of the things is, if you really mean it, you're really going to do something, I think we know that means you have to resource it. And so it doesn't make sense not to have the money in the budget. And so then the concern that does raise is that you're going to see a backlog, that people who are entitled to this are not going to be able to get access to it. That is just as much an issue of justice as not being able to access it under the law. So it's great if the law changes, but if you don't make resource changes, if you don't resource things, then the rights you have under the law or possibilities that you have under the law aren't meaningful and they're not real. And of course, in these cases where resources are required, what's your ordinary Canadian going to do? Now, one of the ways that they could have proceeded with a mass expungement of records in a more efficient way where they needed less money was not to subject people to a process where they had to apply and go to the parole board, which we know already is overburdened. They could have done it automatically. And so doing it automatically would have been a way to do it a lot cheaper. not only would that be okay from the point of view of allocating less resources now, but it just means overall that process would be cheaper for Canadians. That makes sense. Where you can save money, you should save money. This is a place where I believe that they could have, and they're not.